If you've spent any real time in these mountains, you already know certain roads don't get driven after midnight. You know certain bridges have a reputation old enough that nobody alive can tell you exactly when it started, only that their grandmother wouldn't cross it either. This list covers 8 of those bridges, real places, real counties, real history, in most cases far darker than any ghost story layered on top of it. Stick around to the end, because the final one on this list isn't really a ghost story at all. It's one of the most documented disasters in American industrial history, and it happened in the shadow of a bridge most people only know from postcards. Number 8. Stanford Road Bridge, Helltown, Ohio. We start inside Cuyahoga Valley National Park, in the area locals still call Helltown, a stretch of land the federal government bought up in the 1970s for a parkway project that never got built, leaving behind empty roads and shuttered houses that gave the area its nickname. In the middle of all that abandoned infrastructure sits Stanford Road Bridge, known locally as Crybaby Bridge. The legend says if you park on the bridge, turn off the engine, and honk your horn 3 times, you'll hear the cries of a ghostly infant, and some claim to see the apparition of a woman searching for her lost child. What's actually documented is simpler and a little less supernatural. This is one of dozens of Crybaby Bridge legends scattered across the eastern United States, almost always attached to a low, unremarkable creek crossing rather than anything dramatic. Folklorists who study the pattern point out these stories tend to cluster around exactly the kind of isolated water crossing where historically a community would want young people and children to stay away from after dark. And a ghost story does that job a lot more effectively than a sign. Real or not, Helltown draws thrill seekers every Halloween season, enough that park rangers regularly remind visitors the land is still federal property, the houses are still condemned, and trespassing still carries real penalties. The ghost is optional, the fines are not. Number 7. Poinsett Bridge, Greenville County, South Carolina. This next one is real history first and ghost story second. Poinsett Bridge sits in Greenville County near Landrum and Travelers Rest, and it's often called the oldest bridge in South Carolina, a Gothic-style stone arch built in the early 1800s as part of a mountain road system. Even in daylight, people describe the bridge as feeling unusual, old stonework deep in quiet woods that looks like it belongs to another century entirely. The haunting itself is where the story gets interesting, because unlike a lot of bridges on this list, Poinsett doesn't have one clean legend. Visitors report screams or moans near the bridge, strange lights, shadowy figures, the sense of being watched, cars that won't start after a nighttime visit, and a recurring but inconsistent claim that someone was hanged near the bridge at some point in its history. That inconsistency is, in a strange way, the most honest part of the legend. People hear a version, add a detail, and pass it on, until the bridge becomes something larger than the historic structure it actually is. What's not in dispute is the engineering. Poinsett Bridge has survived close to 2 centuries in those woods, built by hand, by people who never could have guessed what the public would eventually decide it was guarding. Number 6. Stuckey's Bridge, Newton County, Mississippi. Now we're into documented territory in a different way, because this next bridge is named after a real man, for a real reason, and the historical record backs almost all of it up. Stuckey's Bridge crosses the Chunky River in Newton County, Mississippi, an iron truss bridge built in 1901 that's still standing, still walkable, and named for a man local history records as a ferryman in the late 1800s who used his position at the river crossing to rob and kill travelers passing through for years before he was finally caught. When the community caught him, they didn't wait on a courtroom. According to the documented local account, he was hanged from the crossing he'd used as his hunting ground. That part, the man, the crimes, the hanging, sits in Newton County's own historical record, not just campfire retelling. What grew up around it afterward is legend layered on real violence. A rope mark locals insist never fully left the original timber, figures reported on the bridge after dark, and a reputation solid enough that Stuckey's Bridge has become one of the most visited, reportedly haunted sites in the state, drawing paranormal investigators every year who, by most accounts, rarely stay until sunrise. It's worth sitting with what makes this one different from the rest of the list. This isn't a story about an ambiguous tragedy nobody can quite pin down. It's a story about a real serial predator who used a real river crossing as a hunting ground, and a community that handled it the only way isolated mountain communities in the 1890s often could. The ghost story is almost secondary to the history. The history is the disturbing part. Number 5. The Footbridges of Roaring Fork, Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Roaring Fork Motor Trail outside Gatlinburg is one of the most photographed drives in the Smokies. Old homesteads, rushing water, footbridges crossing the creek at half a dozen points along the route. It's also home to one of the most repeated ghost stories in East Tennessee. The story, passed down for generations, involves a young woman locals call Lucy, said to have died in a cabin fire in this area in the early 1900s. As the legend goes, a young bachelor spotted a lone, barefoot woman in the woods on a cold winter night and offered to share his horse with her, and was struck by her beauty enough that he sought out her parents to ask for her hand, only to learn she had died about a year earlier. She's said to still appear along the road today, looking for a ride. It's a classic vanishing hitchhiker structure, one of the oldest and most widely distributed legend types in American folklore, found in nearly every region of the country in some form. What makes the Roaring Fork version distinct is how specifically it's tied to the small footbridges along the trail, rather than the road in general. Locals who grew up nearby describe a specific unease at the creek crossings themselves, not the open stretches between them, which tracks with something we've seen on every bridge on this list so far. The crossing point, not the road, is where the story lives. Number 4. Pope Lick Trestle, Fisherville, Kentucky. This is the one on the list where the history isn't subtle at all, and I want to be direct about it before we go further. People have genuinely died here, repeatedly, over decades, and the danger is not folklore. The Pope Lick Trestle is a railroad bridge over Pope Lick Creek in the Fisherville area of Louisville, Kentucky, home to the legend of the Pope Lick Monster, a part man, part goat creature said to lure trespassers onto the tracks using hypnosis or voice mimicry before an oncoming train. Despite a common assumption that the trestle is abandoned, it actually carries a major active rail line, with heavy freight trains crossing it multiple times a day. In 1988, 17-year-old Jack J.C. Charles Baum II was struck and killed by a train on the trestle, with another young man injured in the same incident. In 1994, a man was killed when his ATV overturned and trapped him on the tracks. And in 2000, a 19-year-old fell to his death while trying to escape an oncoming train. More recently, 15-year-old Savannah Bright was killed at the trestle in 2019, along with another teenager, in an incident her family says happened despite warnings she'd been given about the location's reputation. Railroad police have made repeated efforts to keep people off the structure, including fencing and the threat of arrest for trespassing, and have called the trestle one of the only places they know of with this kind of pull on people. The monster may or may not be real. The trestle's body count is not in dispute, and it is the single clearest reason on this entire list why don't cross after dark is genuinely good advice and not just atmosphere. Number 3. The Wampus Cat Crossings, Cherokee Foothills, North Carolina and Tennessee. Not every entry on this list centers on one fixed bridge, and this one's an exception worth including because it explains so much about why Mountain Creek crossings carry the weight they do across the entire region. The Wampus Cat is widely linked to Cherokee tradition, though its exact origins are harder to pin down than the popular version suggests. And Appalachian folklore doesn't tell it as one single story, but as several versions that merge together over time. One version describes a Cherokee woman cursed by a sorcerer after being caught spying on a sacred hunting ceremony, condemned to wander the hills as a cat-like creature, while other versions, shaped by later European settler folklore, describe a shape-shifting witch instead. Reported sightings continue even now, typically tied to strange sounds, livestock killed in the night, and unexplained movement in remote terrain, though nothing has ever been confirmed. Across the southern Appalachians, the creature is consistently associated with creek crossings and footbridges specifically, rather than open trail, fitting the same liminal space pattern that shows up everywhere on this list. Whatever the explanation, the Wampus Cat remains one of the most widely shared pieces of oral tradition in the entire region, predating almost every other story on this list by a wide margin. Number 2. Hawks Nest Tunnel and the Gauley Bridge Crossing, Fayette County, West Virginia. This next one needs to be handled with more weight than the rest of the list, because it isn't really a ghost story. It's one of the worst industrial disasters in American history, and it happened almost exactly here. In 1930, Union Carbide's subsidiary began construction on a 3-mile tunnel through Gauley Mountain near Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, to divert water from the New River to a hydroelectric plant. The project employed nearly 3,000 men, 3/4 of them black migrant laborers recruited during the Great Depression, even though the surrounding county was overwhelmingly white. Ventilation was poor, and water was rarely used to suppress the rock dust. Even as visiting executives wore protective gear the workers were not given. Men emerging from the tunnel were described as coated ghost white in silica dust so thick it left drinking water in the camps looking milky. A 1986 state historical marker at Hawks Nest State Park records 109 admitted deaths from acute silicosis, but a congressional hearing later placed the toll at 476 between 1930 and 1935. And later historians, including Dr. Martin Cherniak in his medical history of the disaster, estimated the real number at over 764, calling even that a conservative figure. Many of the men who died were poor black migrants who could not be buried in local white cemeteries and were instead buried hastily, some under cover of darkness, in unmarked graves. Those graves were later disturbed and relocated when a nearby highway was widened in the 1970s, and the dead went unmarked for decades until a memorial was finally dedicated in 2012. There's a quieter detail in the historical record that connects this directly to a bridge crossing. When the graves were disinterred for the highway project, the remains were carried several miles and reburied near Hughes Bridge on the Gauley River. Tour operators on the river today, by multiple accounts, will point out the New River Gorge Bridge to visitors and say nothing at all about the tunnel a few hundred yards downstream, where hundreds of men died for a power company's bottom line. We're not going to dress this one up with a ghost story because it doesn't need one. The dust, the unmarked graves, the silence from the companies, and even some of the tour guides who profit from this gorge today, that's disturbing enough on its own. If you take one piece of real history away from this entire video. Number 1. Silver Bridge, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And that brings us to the bridge that, more than any other on this list, changed how an entire region thinks about omens. The Silver Bridge was a suspension bridge completed in 1928, carrying traffic across the Ohio River between Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio. A year before its collapse, beginning in November 1966, multiple witnesses in the area began independently reporting a tall, winged, red-eyed humanoid creature near an abandoned World War II munitions site outside town. Sightings that would eventually be known across the country as the Mothman. Then, on December 15, 1967, 10 days before Christmas, during rush-hour traffic, the bridge gave way. 46 people were killed in the collapse, and 2 of the victims were never recovered. The cause, determined by investigators afterward, was mechanical, a single corroded eye-bar in the suspension chain that failed under the combined stress of age, traffic load, and design flaws nobody had caught in nearly 4 decades of use. It remains one of the deadliest bridge failures in U.S. history. In the aftermath, many locals began connecting the Mothman sightings to the tragedy, wondering whether the creature had been a warning, an omen, or something else they had no framework for. And after the collapse, the sightings in the area stopped almost entirely, though the legend never did. A respected investigator into the case has said he doesn't believe that many separate witnesses could have independently invented the same detailed story, even while acknowledging that what they actually encountered may never be fully explained. What makes Point Pleasant different from everywhere else on this list is what the town chose to do with it. Rather than bury the story, the community built a festival around it, held every September, drawing visitors from across the country to a town that, without the bridge collapse, very few outsiders would ever have heard of. It's a strange kind of memorial, equal parts genuine grief for 46 real people who never came home from a rush-hour commute, and the community's way of making sure the world never forgets why that particular crossing matters. The new bridge that replaced it sits a short distance from where the original stood. Locals will tell you plainly that they still don't love crossing it after dark. Not because of a creature in the tree line, but because some towns never fully get over losing 46 people on a Friday before Christmas. And the water under that bridge remembers it even when the traffic moving over it doesn't. 8 bridges, 8 counties, across 5 different states. And if you actually look at what's documented rather than what's legend, the pattern that emerges isn't really about ghosts at all. It's about the things mountain communities couldn't get a courtroom, a corporation, or sometimes even the historical record itself to fully reckon with. A serial predator, handled by the only justice an isolated 1890s river community had access to. A company that knowingly worked men to death in a cloud of silica dust and buried them without names. A structural failure that killed 46 people during a Friday rush hour because nobody caught one bad eyebar in time. The folklore that grew up around these crossings isn't separate from that history. It's how communities with no other outlet kept the memory alive long after the official record moved on. That's worth remembering the next time you see a haunted bridge video promising a ghost with no backstory. Sometimes the real history is the part that should actually keep you up at night. And it usually doesn't need a single invented detail to do it. If there's a bridge in your part of the country with this same kind of reputation, the real history behind it, not just the campfire version, tell us in the comments. We read every one, and we'd rather chase the documented story than the manufactured one. Thanks for crossing all 8 with us.